Welcome, welcome, welcome. This lesson is understanding the defrost control board, and it is going to be a first in the series of several defrost control board lessons. I know when I first started out as a technician and I was working on heat pumps, defrost control boards were pretty confusing and intimidating. So we're going to just break it down into bite-sized chunks and make sure that you understand it from front to back. We're not going to talk about too much detail about the heating or cooling or defrost. We're only going to talk about the inputs, outputs, and some of the sensors that are on the control board. Now, before you start working on any type of unit, it's a good idea to see if you can find the installation guide in this installation manual. Besides having a detailed system operation description, it's going to have a nice depiction of the layout of the control board and where some of the components are, where some of the connections are, and so forth. And it also has a great schematic and line diagram here in great detail, several different looks to it to help you troubleshoot all of the notes, all of the component designators, and even the optional components that could be on that system. So if you can find it, you need to go ahead and get that in your hands before you start troubleshooting. Unfortunately, you're going to usually end up with the minimalistic schematic diagram that they have inside of the condensing unit. So we're going to use that for this lesson because this is what you're going to be using most of the time anyway. Before we get started, I just want you to get used to talking about especially control wiring properly. And a lot of new technicians always want to talk wire colors, yellow and orange and red and white and blue. And conveniently, we have yellow on a Y terminal, orange on the O terminal, red on the R terminal, and so on. And if you need to call tech support or anyone when you're working on something to get some clarification on how things work, a lot of the new technicians, I don't know why they always want to say, well, the red and the white and the orange, when they should be talking Y and O and R. Because what happens is throughout the years, if there's been any repairs on the control wiring, or if you just have an installer that does it differently, you may not have a yellow wire on the Y terminal or an orange wire on the O terminal. So just make sure when you're talking about the connections and the control wiring that you're talking about the terminal designators and not the wire colors themselves. So let's start out with the control wiring connections. On this defrost control board, there's a nice terminal block. Some defrost control boards will not have a terminal block, and these will be wire netted in to a little pigtail. The other thing to note is this is a general overview of how defrost control boards work. They're all a little bit different, but this is just a general overview to help you understand it. In later lessons, we'll get into some different control boards and how they operate differently, but this happens to be a Linux, and this is pretty indicative of what you're gonna see. All right, so let's take a look at our inputs, control inputs. When we're talking about these control inputs here, just remember that those come from look over here on the schematic, the thermostat via the air handling unit, via control wiring that was installed when the system was put in to the control board. Do you see that? So these wires are designated by the dotted lines here on the schematic diagram. So inputs, first one is the Y terminal. This is a 24 volt input. It's either present or not. 24 volts is applied to the Y terminal when there's a call for heating and cooling to energize the contactor to turn on the condensing unit. The O terminal is for the reversing valve, And in a heat pump, that reversing valve determines whether it's in the heating or cooling mode. So when 24 volts is applied, it energizes the reversing valve. When 24 volts is removed, it de-energizes the reversing valve. And again, this all comes from the thermostat inside the home via the air handling unit. Then we have the R terminal. Now the R terminal is a constant 24 volts. It is the power to the board. Our power lights are on here, and it also provides power for the microprocessor that controls the defrost timing and so forth on the control board. Then we have the C terminal, which is the common 24 volt common terminal. Now if you don't have 24 volts on, we'll go back to the R terminal. If you don't have 24 volts on that R terminal, this entire control board is going to be dead. Nothing's going to work. All right, so that concludes the control voltage inputs that come from the thermostat. Now let's talk about some of the line voltage or the line voltage input. And that is right here up on the control board, top right. And that is one leg of the 230 volts. And if you look on the schematic, this terminal up here on the control board, on the top right of the control board, is designated by this circle right here on the schematic diagram. So this is a 230 volt input to the control board. All right, so we'll do a quick review. Y terminal, 24 volt signal to turn on or off the condensing unit. O terminal, 24 volt signal to energize or de-energize the reversing valve. R, constant 24 volts for the control board power. C, the 24 volt return voltage. And one of these terminals up here, the top left one, is one leg of the 230 volts for the condenser fan. All right, so here we're going to talk about outputs. Now let's go back to our control wiring and our terminal block. We didn't talk about the W terminal, and that's because that is a control voltage output. When this heat pump goes into the defrost mode, what it does is goes back basically into the cooling mode. So when you're heating and it frosts up and it needs to defrost, it goes back into the cooling mode. Well, that's not very convenient or comfortable for someone in the home. So this W1 terminal sends 24 volts back out to turn on the electric strip heat. Now we'll talk more about that in another lesson when we get into the heating and defrost mode, but that is an output there. And let's talk about these terminals over here on the left. These are all output terminals, and they are 24 volts out. And this is what is really used to control what's going on with the condensing unit. So let's first talk about these big black terminals right here. This goes to the reversing valve, and what happens is down here on the O terminal, when we get a 24 volt signal that energizes the reversing valve, it finds its way through the control board and it goes out to the reversing valve to energize that reversing valve. And then we have another terminal, which is a set of terminals which are the red ones down here in the bottom left. This is what turns the contactor on, that when it's energized, it turns on the condensing unit. So in a more simplified manner, what will happen is we have 24 volts comes in on the Y terminal, finds its way through the control board, and out it goes to the contactor to energize the contactor and turn on the compressor and condenser fan motor when there's a call for cooling. Now there's a couple more terminals here. The black terminals and the yellow ones, those are high and low pressure switch controls. These just are safety controls, and let's look at the schematic over here quickly. When we have a 24 volt signal coming in on the Y terminal, I know I said it went to the Y out, but what it does is it goes through the high pressure switch and sees if there's it looks to see if there's a high pressure fault. If there isn't, it goes right back in through the control board. Then it looks for a low pressure fault on the low pressure control, and then it finds its way back out to energize the contactor. All right, so these are your high and low pressure controls to indicate if there's a fault. What those do is it will not allow that heat pump to turn on if there's a high or low pressure fault. We'll talk more about that a little bit later, and how when we get into the troubleshooting portion of this. Okay, a couple other ones that we need to look at, and that is right up here on the top left of the control board. These are indicated over here on the schematic, and they are the defrost coil sensor and the ambient air temperature sensor. And these just report back to the microprocessor what the temperature of the outdoor air is and what the temperature of the condensing coil is. So that is it for your defrost control inputs and outputs. On the website, you can download this diagram right here, re-listen to this screencast, and take your notes if you'd like. And you can listen to it as many times as you would like. Now I'd like to thank you very much for being patient and listening to this class. If you have any questions, please email me at ron@hvactrainingsolutions.net. We also have a forum, which is a great place to put questions and look for the answers for your questions. We're building that as a knowledge base, so I would prefer that you post it at the forum, but I will be more than happy to help you any way that I can, and we will talk with you on your next lesson.